David Walker woke up to the kind of pain that cuts through the fog of sleep and burrows deep into the core of your consciousness. It wasn't just a physical pain, it was the kind of pain that rattled you, made your heart race, your breath catch. As he lay there, eyes flickering open, he could feel the familiar tightness in his chest, a sharp burn beneath his skin. He knew what was happening before his brain even fully registered it. Something inside him had ruptured. It wasn't the kind of injury a normal person could survive. If anyone else had been in this situation, they'd be dead. But David wasn't like other people. David had the ability to heal, to repair himself from anything. That was his gift. The pain reached a crescendo, unbearable and all-encompassing, before it began to ebb away. Slowly, so slowly that it almost felt like he was waiting for it to pass, his chest began to close. Muscle fibers twisted back into place, skin stretched over the wound like soft dough, and bones slid back into alignment with a soft, almost satisfying pop. His body had been torn open, but now it was whole again. The pain had melted away, leaving only a faint ache and the strange feeling of having been somewhere else. Of having been different. David sat up on the bed, his hand reaching instinctively to touch his chest, the area where the wound had been. But there was no mark, no scar. Nothing at all. It was as if it had never happened. And yet, as he pressed his palm against his skin, he could feel something was off. His body was the same, but there was a distinct unfamiliarity to it. A slight rigidity, a little more tension in his muscles. His fingers, the ones that had once felt so sure of themselves, now seemed foreign. His hand hovered for a moment, unsure whether to press harder, to look deeper. Something had changed, but he couldn't pinpoint what. Then, as the fog of pain began to clear, an odd thought flickered through his mind. What happened before this? David sat frozen. It was like a small glitch in his mind, a momentary hiccup in his perception of reality. He couldn't remember what had caused the injury in the first place. The details were vague, slipping away like sand through his fingers. His last memory was a haze, and the more he focused, the fuzzier it became. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. No use dwelling on things he couldn't recall. He had the ability to heal, to move forward, and that was all that mattered. But as he stood and walked toward the bathroom mirror, his unease grew. When he looked into the glass, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. The reflection was his, but the eyes weren't quite right. They were distant, unsettled, as if he had seen things that were too painful to remember. What happened to me? It wasn't a question he usually asked himself. David had always felt in control, had always trusted that his healing powers would protect him, would fix him, no matter what. The world outside might be chaotic, but his body was his to command. He could live through anything. But now, as he stood there, staring into his own eyes, it felt like something was missing. A part of him had been lost. David's ability to heal was something he discovered when he was 15. He hadn't meant to, of course. It wasn't as if he had woken up one day and thought, "Hey, I think I'll be invincible today." No, it had happened by accident, like most of life's greatest surprises. It was a stupid accident, really. A stupid, teenage boy kind of accident. A dare, a motorcycle, a jump from one rooftop to another. The kind of thing that only an invincible teenager would try. He remembered the thrill, the wind rushing through his hair, the feeling of flight as he soared through the air, before the crash. The fall was brutal. He hit the ground hard, right on his back, the impact jarring through his body like 100 punches, and then, he remembered nothing. When he woke up, though, he was in the hospital. His parents were beside him, crying, and the doctors were standing around, bewildered. He had broken several bones, cracked ribs, and bruised nearly every organ. Yet, after a few hours, David had healed. His body mended itself, piece by piece, as though nothing had happened. He was sore, yes, but whole. His parents, of course, were thrilled. They chalked it up to some sort of miracle, and maybe it was. David never really understood it, but he had learned to live with it. At first, it was all fun and games. He would jump off the highest building just to see if he could survive. He'd take risks, pick fights, do whatever he wanted. He always healed. It was like he was untouchable, but the consequences of his abilities started to show themselves after a while. Small things at first. He'd wake up and forget what he had for breakfast. Forget a conversation he'd had the night before. Forget the name of someone he'd known for years. And yet, there was no real reason for it. It didn't seem important at the time, but the losses piled up. Slowly. Gradually. Until one day, he realized that he didn't remember anything about his childhood, about the places he'd grown up. He couldn't remember his first kiss, the music he used to listen to, or the girl he had once loved. The memories were like paper, crumbling away every time he healed. The more he healed, the less he remembered. The less he was himself. David had never spoken to anyone about it. No one knew. How could he explain something so bizarre? The power he had, the gift, had always been a secret, something he kept hidden from the world. But the cost, the price he paid for it, was becoming too heavy to ignore. As the weeks passed, David began to rely more and more on his healing abilities. It wasn't deliberate, at first. He would find himself in a dangerous situation, an argument, a fight, an accident, and without thinking, he would let his power take over. And when he healed, it was always the same. The memories would slip. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, unnoticed ways. It was like a slow erasure, like water washing away a shore, bit by bit. By the time David woke up that morning with his chest torn open, he had already lost so much. His past, his history, was slipping away. And he didn't know how to stop it. David sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples, trying to piece together what was happening to him. How could he be losing his memories? Was this power of his, this gift, actually a curse? It seemed absurd. How could healing, something that should make him whole, break him down instead? And yet, here he was. He reached for his phone, absently scrolling through contacts. Names, faces, all blurred. Every conversation, every text message felt like it had happened to someone else. David needed answers. And he needed them fast. But where would he even begin? There were no books on this. No one had ever documented a power like his. Not in any science fiction novel, not in any myth. His healing was unique. Unexplainable. And now, it was beginning to consume him in ways he couldn't understand. Maybe he could find someone who had experienced something similar. Someone who could shed light on the truth of what was happening to him. As he put the phone down, his eyes wandered back to the mirror. He stared into his reflection, searching for some kind of clue, something that would make sense of all this. But the only thing he saw staring back at him was the face of a man who was slowly forgetting who he was, and that, he realized, was far more terrifying than anything he could heal. David couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly connected to himself. The world outside felt like a vague dream, a place he could see but not quite touch. He walked through his daily life like a ghost, never really engaging with the people around him, never really feeling present. The people he interacted with seemed to belong to another version of reality, one that he was slowly drifting away from. His job, a mundane desk position at an insurance company, felt like a lifeline to the world he used to know. But even there, his mind would wander. One moment, he'd be explaining some policy to a client, the next, he'd forget the entire conversation. His coworkers had started to notice, but they didn't say anything. David didn't blame them. How could they understand? No one could. The more he tried to fix himself, the more fragmented he became. His memories, once so vivid, were now like faded photographs, curling at the edges. Faces blurred, names slipped away. He had forgotten what it was like to have a solid sense of self. And even as he tried to hold on to the things that mattered, he knew it was futile. The power of healing, which had once seemed like a miracle, was now a curse, erasing pieces of him every time it worked its magic. That morning, after the incident with his chest, David had decided to do something about it. Something drastic. He couldn't keep living like this, unable to remember the most important parts of who he was. He needed answers. He needed to understand the truth about his ability. And so, he found himself walking into a dimly lit bookstore, tucked away between a coffee shop and an old record store. The kind of place most people would overlook, but David wasn't like most people. His hand brushed the worn spines of countless books as he meandered down aisles, his fingers grazing the gold-embossed titles. His mind was focused, but the weight of his power pressed down on him, like an invisible hand, and his thoughts began to scatter again. It was then he saw it. The title of a book, tucked away on the bottom shelf. The Secrets of Self-Healing, the Untold Stories of the Body's True Potential. It was worn, its edges frayed, the cover yellowed with age. But something about it caught his attention. It seemed to hum with promise, a strange feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. He pulled the book off the shelf, dusting it off before flipping it open. The first page was blank, as though someone had torn out whatever had once been written there. But as he turned the next page, his eyes fell on a quote: "Power is a gift. A gift that costs more than you can ever know. You will lose everything, your memories, your identity, even the very essence of yourself. But the question remains, is the price worth it?" The words stuck to him like oil on his skin. He read them again, and again, until they burned into his mind. Was this book about him? Could it be? The pages of the book revealed a fragmented history, tales of individuals who had been gifted with abilities to heal, to regenerate, and to survive. But there was a common theme: each person had paid a price. A price far steeper than they had ever imagined. The more they healed, the more they lost. They became shells of themselves, unable to remember who they were before their powers consumed them. David flipped through the book, his heart pounding. He had thought he was the only one. But here, in these pages, were stories of others like him. And if what the book was saying was true, if their stories were real, then David was on the same path. He closed the book, the weight of its implications sinking in. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to find someone who could help him, someone who understood what was happening to him. Maybe this book was the key to unlocking the answers he needed. But it wasn't enough to simply read about it. He needed to meet someone who had lived through it. Someone who had survived the healing, but at what cost? The journey to find answers led him to a place he had never thought to go before, an old man who lived on the outskirts of the city, in a crumbling house that looked as though it had been forgotten by time. The man's name was Ezekiel, and he was rumored to have once had the same powers as David. But Ezekiel was a shadow of the man he once had been. David didn't know what to expect when he knocked on the door, but the face that greeted him was one that made his stomach twist. Ezekiel was gaunt, his face drawn and hollow, his eyes sunken into his skull. There was a sadness in his gaze, an emptiness that spoke of years lost to something far worse than age. "You came," Ezekiel said, his voice raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "I knew someone would eventually." David hesitated before speaking. You were like me, right? You healed. You can," his voice faltered. Ezekiel's lips twitched into a bitter smile. "I could. I used to. But now." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, he seemed to retreat into himself. "Now, I don't even remember what it was like to be whole." David felt a chill run down his spine. He took a step forward, but Ezekiel held up a hand. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair. "You've got a lot of questions. And I've got answers. But I can't promise you'll like them." David sat down, his mind racing. He had so many questions, but he didn't know where to start. Ezekiel had been through it. He had lived the life David was now stumbling through, the one that felt like it was slipping away with every moment that passed. Ezekiel stared at him for a long while before speaking again. "You think this power is a blessing, don't you? That's how it always starts. You think you can do anything, that you're untouchable. You heal, you survive, and nothing can harm you. But it takes more than you realize. David nodded slowly, the weight of Ezekiel's words pressing down on him. He had always felt that way, invincible, beyond harm. But now, it was clear. He wasn't invincible. He was just another victim of the very thing he thought would save him. You want to know what happens when you keep healing? Ezekiel asked, his voice growing softer. You forget. You lose who you are. Your past, your memories, they slip away. It starts with little things, and before you know it, you won't even recognize yourself. David's heart raced. Is there a way to stop it? To fix it? Ezekiel's eyes narrowed, and he leaned in closer. There's no fixing it. There's only surviving. The more you heal, the less you'll be. You'll be a ghost of yourself, a shadow that doesn't even know what it's running from. David didn't know how to respond. He had spent so long trying to hold on to his power, convinced that it was the key to his survival. But now, Ezekiel's words echoed in his mind, and he knew they were true. The price was too high. The cost was more than he could bear. I've been where you are, Ezekiel said, his voice barely a whisper now. And I've seen the end of it. You can't outrun the past. You can't heal your way out of it. All you can do is let it go, or it will swallow you whole. David felt a sense of finality settle over him. He had always thought healing was the answer. But now, he realized that it was the question. And the answer was something he wasn't ready to face. That he stood up, his legs weak beneath him. I need to think. Ezekiel nodded, his face unreadable. You'll figure it out. But remember this, the longer you hold on to it, the less you'll have left to hold on to. David turned and walked out the door, the weight of the man's words hanging heavy in the air. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was certain, his healing had come with a cost. And the price had only just begun to reveal itself. The city stretched out before David like a vast, indifferent landscape, its buzzing life and constant motion a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in his mind. He had walked aimlessly for hours after leaving Ezekiel's house, the old man's words pounding in his head with every step. You can't outrun the past. You can't heal your way out of it. David had always thought of healing as the solution, as the ultimate escape. Every injury, every pain, every bruise could be undone. But what Ezekiel had said, what he had become, it shattered that illusion. David wasn't running from physical harm anymore. He was running from himself. From the person he used to be. The person who was still buried deep inside, somewhere, lost in the fog of forgotten memories. He paused at an intersection, the noise of traffic blaring in the background, and for the first time in months, David felt something stir deep within him. He wasn't just running away from memories anymore. He was running away from the truth. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He fumbled for it and saw a message from a number he didn't recognize. The message was short, almost cryptic. You don't have to do this. There's still time. David stared at the screen, his stomach clenching. He didn't know who the message was from, but it felt familiar. Like someone who had known him before everything started to fall apart. His heart raced as he tried to trace the feeling, but the more he thought about it, the more his mind slipped further into a void. He had no idea who it was. The name meant nothing to him. Shaking his head, David deleted the message. He didn't have time to dwell on it. He couldn't afford distractions, not when everything was falling apart. He needed to face the reality that healing wasn't the answer anymore. That there was no easy fix, no quick solution to the hole inside him. He needed to let go. But how? How could he simply let go of everything he had been, everything he had ever known? David returned to his apartment that evening, the place feeling emptier than ever before. He had lived there for years, but tonight, it felt like a foreign land. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each sound sharp and alien. The walls, the furniture, the pictures of faces that didn't belong to him anymore. All of it seemed like a distant memory, a story that didn't have an ending. He dropped his keys onto the counter, his gaze drifting toward the mirror that hung on the far wall. The reflection was his, but it wasn't. The face staring back at him had grown unfamiliar. It was the face of a man who had forgotten who he was. There was no sense in trying to escape anymore. He had tried. He had used his power to heal, to outrun the consequences of his own actions. But the price was too high. His past had been erased piece by piece, and now, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He wasn't sure if he had ever been anyone at all. David sat down on the edge of the couch, his hands trembling as they rested on his knees. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly alive. The constant need to heal, to fix, had dulled everything around him. His relationships, his passions, even his own sense of self had withered under the weight of his ability. And then there was the crushing truth that weighed on him now: he had to let go. Let go of the past, of the memories that had defined him, and embrace the future, whatever that might look like. But the future was terrifying. The future was a blank slate, and David had no idea what he would become without the weight of his past, without the memories that had once given him shape. It was then that his phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't hesitate to open it. The message was the same as before, but there was a second line that wasn't there before: "You're running from yourself, but you're not alone. Find me. It's not too late to remember." The words hit him like a slap to the face. The message wasn't just cryptic. It was personal. Whoever was sending these messages knew exactly what he was going through. Knew the turmoil, the fear, the loneliness. David's hands shook as he typed a quick reply, his fingers moving faster than he could think. "Who is this? What do you want from me?" For several minutes, there was nothing. David stared at the screen, his breath shallow, the tension in his chest rising. Just as he was about to toss the phone aside, a new message appeared: "Come to the old warehouse on 5th and Willow. I have the answers you need. You're not alone, David. You never were." The words haunted him, their weight sinking deeper into his chest. It could be a trap, he thought. Or maybe it was just another part of his mind, playing tricks on him. But then, another thought pierced through the fog: what if it wasn't? What if this was the key? What if this person held the answers to the questions that had been gnawing at him for so long? David wasn't sure what made him stand up, what made him head out into the night toward the warehouse. Maybe it was the desperation, the desire to understand. Or maybe it was just the instinct to find something, anything, that could help him make sense of the nightmare he was living. The warehouse loomed in the distance as he approached, an old, decrepit building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a sea of overgrown grass and shadows. The streets were quiet, empty, as if the world had decided to hold its breath. David's footsteps were heavy as he walked toward the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the weight of the unknown pressing against him, the fear of what he might find, what he might lose. But he couldn't stop. Not now. The door creaked open as he pushed it, and inside, the air was thick with dust. The dim light from a single bulb overhead cast long shadows across the concrete floor. There was no one in sight, and for a moment, David wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe this was all a game, a trick. But then he heard it, a voice, soft but clear: "You came." David spun around to face the source of the voice, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the corner of the room, bathed in shadow, was a man. A man who looked like David. Not in the sense of being a twin or a doppelganger, but in the way that certain people looked like versions of themselves, altered, reshaped by time or experience. The man in front of him had the same eyes, the same set of features, but there was something in his face that told David this man had lived through what he was living through. "You've been searching for answers, haven't you?" the man asked. His voice was calm, measured, as if he knew exactly what David had been through. "You've been running from your past, from the memories that slip away every time you heal. I'm here to tell you that you don't have to keep running." David couldn't speak. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. The man before him was no stranger. He knew David. And yet, he didn't. He couldn't. "How do you know me?" David finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. The man stepped into the light, and for the first time, David saw the full extent of the resemblance. The man's face was worn, like his own, but there was an underlying pain there, a deep weariness that spoke of years spent losing oneself, losing memories. "I know you," the man said, "because I've been where you are. I was you." David's blood ran cold. He couldn't breathe. The realization hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. The man in front of him wasn't just someone who had experienced the same thing. He was someone who had become what David feared to become. A version of himself, stripped of the past, stripped of everything that had once made him whole. "This is what happens," the man said softly, his eyes meeting David's. "This is what you have to face. You can keep healing. You can keep running. But the more you heal, the less you'll be." David took a step back, his mind reeling. But the man's gaze held him steady, an unspoken understanding between them. "You can't outrun it," the man said, his voice like the echo of a ghost. "But you can accept it. Let go, David. Before it takes everything." David's knees felt weak. The answer was here, staring him in the face, but it was too much to bear. The truth was staring at him, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it.